Welcome to the third installment of building the ultimate Miter Saw Workstation. In this installment, we're going to look at the details that are so necessary to make this workstation, well, work. I love to put laminate on the tops of my work surfaces in the shop. The difficulty here was how to mount this laminate on this lower section once the cabinet was built. So I spent a lot of time noodling through that. I could have probably mounted the laminate to the board before I glued up the entire assembly. I would have had to have left a blank area on the sides about 1/4 of an inch deep to fit into the dados. And that looked like that was going to probably be difficult. Putting the laminate on afterwards also presented some problems though. How to get it flush up to this edge on either side, that was a problem. And then how to get it trimmed off flush on the front and the back. Now normally when you put on laminate, it's really pretty straightforward on a tabletop. You put some glue on the laminate, you put some glue on the top, you let it dry for a little bit, then you stick it down. And whatever is overlapping around the sides, you take your trim router with a guide bit, laminate trim bit, and you just go around, you trim it all flush with the edges, and it's gorgeous. Here, however, if I was to put a laminate trim bit into a router, and run the router along the edge, as soon as the edge of the router base hit the edge here, that's as far as I could go. And it would leave a section untrimmed over here about half the width of the router base. So how to trim that off? Well, you can cut that off and then use a file and file it down till you get it even with the rest. That's kind of a lot of trouble too, and that's sort of open to making a few mistakes. So I didn't really want to take that risk on doing that once the system was built. So I really noodled through how to do this, and finally what I came up with was I cut a piece of plywood out exactly the same size as this inset portion. Exactly. I mean, I got it exact. Once that plywood was cut out in exactly the same size, I then clamped the laminate to the plywood, no glue, clamped it down. You could use double stick tape as well. I clamped it down and ran the router around and trimmed it perfectly to fit that go-by piece of plywood. Then it was pretty easy to apply the glue, line up one edge, line it up with the front, and roll it into place, and it fit just perfectly, and I didn't have to do any trimming on the front or back edges. Applying the laminate to the rest of the top was really straightforward. Again, just glue it down, use a trim router, and trim the 4 edges off. The next big step, though, was to figure out how to put in this T-track. My concern with routing for this T-track was really simple. Frankly, I have never routed a piece of wood with the laminate top already attached. And I was really concerned about whether or not it would chip out the laminate as I was routing the groove. And I wanted it to be neat and clean and frankly pretty. So I figured out that I needed to run a test. So I grabbed this board. This is just an old piece of 3/4 inch plywood. This is where I had run test to, this actually was to test for the bottoms of the pedestal cabinets to make sure that I had the width right for 2 sheets of plywood. This is where I ran a little test groove in. This was another test groove I'd cut, but the other side of this was unscathed. So I took it and applied a piece of laminate to it. And it wasn't quite the right size, but I stuck a piece of laminate down to it, and I trimmed it all flush on these 2 edges. And then I set it up on my workbench, set up the guide rail and the router with the correct size bit. In this case it was a 3/4 inch bit, and I started cutting a groove to see how it was going to work. Well, my first test only went in about 1 inch, and I realized it was kind of a semi-disaster. It was chipping the laminate, it was raising it up a little bit, the depth of cut wasn't right for the T-track that I was using, and the whole thing was a bit too narrow. So I had to rethink. So the next thing that I did, I cranked up the speed on the router. That helped a little bit too. But I was still getting chipping on the sides of the Formica, or the laminate. I set this up as a test, and I got my depth correct, and I went in a little further with each test.